being church in a digital age. We are in our last week of this class, and some of you are going to probably think, okay, but what now? I still have questions. We're going to give you an opportunity in our final email to answer a couple survey questions and think, okay, here's what's going to be next for you. But I want to invite you to just absorb all of our information that Ryan has for us today, and I'm grateful for the ways that God is moving in the church, even in the time of COVID. So I'm going to invite us to take a moment and center ourselves in prayer, and then Ryan will turn it over to you. The Lord is with you. Good and gracious God, we give thanks for this day. We thank you that you have given us a gift of technology that admittedly we can abuse and be addicted to, but also has the power to proclaim the gospel and the good news of Jesus the Christ and to build community. Gracious God, I pray that we would be communities of faith committed to using technology so that others may encounter your love, may encounter the gift of relationship with you and with other believers, so that we, gracious God, may exist for the sake of the world to know your incarnational love. Gracious God, this day, open our hearts and our minds. Don't let us get too caught up with the good idea fairy, gracious God, but stir in us that which we need, discern what our next right thing is. Gracious God, may we give you this hour with all of our attention so that we might learn how to bring people together for the sake of the world. And we ask all of this in the name of Jesus the Christ. Amen. And I am again thankful for Ryan and him joining us from his basement in Wisconsin to continue to talk about the gift of technology. And we are grateful that he is going to continue to walk us through and today on the topic of building community. So Ryan, I'm going to let you take it over.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pastor Danielle. Just one quick thing. Could you please make me a co-host so I could share my screen? And while you're doing that, it's so good to see everyone. Once again, my name is Ryan Panzer. I'm broadcasting live from my recording studio, also known as the room where I store the paint cans and the gardening equipment. So really nice to be with you all this morning. Today, we're talking about the topic of building digital community. It's a topic that has become all the more important as we've seen our churches grow accustomed to worshiping online, to gathering online, and we've realized in the process that some of that community we've long enjoyed at church just doesn't quite feel the same. To compound things, our country has had a rather stressful few months here, and I think that those are fracturing some communities, particularly in digital spaces. So today we're going to address a few tactics and a process that will help you to build digital community or imagine what it's like to build digital community as we venture forward into this new normal. This is our third and final webinar, and just to recap, our goals of this series are here, but primarily what we're focused on doing is providing for you a space in which you can reflect and think about what it means to do great ministry online. If we can provide you a moment of pausing and reflecting, we know that this webinar series will have been a success. Just a little more on my background. I've worked in the intersection of church and technology, serving congregations in ministry contexts, working in the tech industry, primarily in instructional design capacities. And I continue to research and write about kind of this fascinating and perplexing intersection of how church meets tech. Our agenda today is as follows. We're going to do a quick lightning round review of the first 2 weeks in case you couldn't join us. We'll talk a little bit about the challenges of community building, the opportunities we have with building community online, and then we're going to explore a little bit about design thinking and explore what it might mean for your congregation to adopt this methodology to create and construct community building moments that fit the specificity of your ministry context. Our last 10 minutes, we'll have some time for breakout discussion where you can discuss how you're applying some of these ideas within your church. So a quick review of the first two webinars on this topic of being church in a digital age. We've talked extensively about the importance of engaging digital culture before we engage any digital technology. The idea is that technology is so interwoven in the fabric of our lives that what matters is the values that technology tends to give us, far more than any technological tactic that might come and go from one day to the next. Similarly, we've been on this journey of exploring how some perceive the church to be in a mode of values that is in some ways outdated from the values that they would like to see in the digital age church, the values of questions, of connection, of collaboration and creativity. And as we've gone through these webinars, I've continued to preach the gospel of digital minimalism, the idea that we ought not to be trying everything. We're not throwing spaghetti up against a wall to see what sticks. We're trying to be really selective and thoughtful about the few tactics that will work in our context. And it's my hope that this third webinar, more so than the other two, will really engage this value of digital minimalism, helping you to shape the specific community building initiatives that are going to work in your context. Just a few quick words of review from last week then. Last week we reviewed some of the ingredients for doing great worship online. We talked about the ingredients of platforms, the differences between Facebook, YouTube, and Zoom. We talked about the differences between live stream and recording and how congregations that are using live stream worship might try to experiment with some various ways of doing recording, or how congregations that are recording their worship might benefit from using live stream on technologies like Facebook and Instagram, particularly throughout the course of the week. We talked last week also about software and the large ecosystem of vendors that exists to bring worship and any church content online. How those software vendors kind of are split between secular all-purpose software solutions like Vimeo, vMix, and Doccast, as well as church-specific options like Truthcast, Christian World Media, and streamingchurch.tv. And we also introduced a framework last week for exploring how to make decisions in evaluating those software vendors. Among the top considerations being, what are your church's technological capabilities right now? And the all-important question, do those vendors offer technical support on Sunday mornings? There were also a few questions last week about licensing and some of the considerations around licensing of music and posting recordings of worship services to YouTube or other social media sites. I did some research into this, and I should preface this by saying I'm not an expert in intellectual property, so this is just my interpretation from talking with some church leaders and from reviewing the CCLI and One License websites this week. But the CCLI permissions state very clearly on their website that if you have the CCLI license, you do have the right to retransmit songs performed in your church services in audio and or video form. In your church services is the key term here, in that if you're performing or singing a song that is part of a worship service, you are covered under the CCLI. One License appears to have the same permissions. One License also specifically called out that they have a podcast and streaming license, which extends the ability to stream on worship to recordings you might do. Like for example, if you wanted to create a congregational podcast, if you wanted to do a concert of worship music with your church musicians and stream that online. So that podcast and streaming license would augment the existing license permissions you have through One License to allow you to do some different things with streaming and recording of music. So Jonathan is posting here in the Zoom chat, we have both CCLI and One License. It is good money well spent. Yeah, thanks for that comment, Jonathan. So I'm going to turn over in just a second to the conversation about community building, the topic of conversation for today's webinar. If you have questions at any time today, please feel free to post them to the Zoom chat. I have that up on my screen, and I'll be responding to questions, comments, pushback, anything you want to throw into the Zoom chat at any point. But if we're going to engage the task of building community in this digital age, we have to be really frank and upfront about why doing so is such a hard thing to do. If you've been to a couple of these webinars, you know by now that I'm really into search trends data as a proxy for cultural sentiment. And this is search data from Google on the search query Zoom fatigue, something that had virtually been unheard of and is now very much in our culture's everyday vernacular. One of the many factors we have that's creating a headwind against building community in digital contexts is just the idea that we're all spending so much time online. And if we're not spending time online, increasingly so many of us are just trying to make things work for our families. This is the search data for the phrase learning pod, or groups of families that gather together so their kids can collaborate on schoolwork that's assigned virtually. I know every school district is trying different things this semester. Here in Madison, Wisconsin, we're fully online and will likely be fully online for some time. So many families are turning to learning pods, which is great, though it requires parents to take considerable time out of their day to be available as mentors and teachers for those learning pods. It's more than just the amount of time that's spent online, though, that matters to this conversation. In other words, the challenges that stand in our way for building digital community are more than just hours spent on Zoom. Some of you may have seen the data on how all of this time spent in isolation during COVID-19 is already starting to have fairly significant consequences on mental and physical health. The Pew Research think tank tells us that 73% of Americans are experiencing a moment of anxiety 2 or more times per week. And the same research from Pew shows us that 43% of Americans are experiencing isolation 2 or more times per week. Without the systems that have created community in the past, community has been a real struggle, not just in church, but in all of our organizations and everything that propped up togetherness before this pandemic began. I even think about something like the coffee hour schedule that my church used to bring folks together outside of the sanctuary after church. And we had a whole system to get donuts from Dunkin' Donuts into our church. Someone would pick up the donuts at Dunkin', someone would hand them off to a coffee hour host. The coffee hour host would hand out the donuts and greet people as they came out of the sanctuary. They would refill coffees, they would replenish the donut trays, and they would wash the donut trays. Now, it was all part of this really efficient, well-oiled machine of scheduling and making sure people were in the right time at the right place. And all of that created this very tight sense of community. Well, unfortunately for Dunkin' Donuts, and for our churches as well, that system has ceased to operate. So many of the mechanisms that we've had to create community in our churches have since dissipated, leaving us with a rather significant void. Community is also difficult to cultivate just based on this moment that we find ourselves in. I find the Pew data really fascinating, and if you don't follow them on social media already, a quick plug to do so, because they are far and away the most significant researcher within the field of digital engagement and within the field of church membership. Pew reported on pandemic-related posts on social media earlier in the spring, and they found that there's about 6.5 million social posts about COVID-19 from 1 month. 74% of those posts linked to news sites, but only 1% linked to what Pew refers to as science sites. Pew did a further breakdown about what those news sites are, and many of them are editorialized, focused more on blogging or op-ed type pieces about the crisis, and not so much about the crisis itself. All of this to say that when we look at the landscape of social media and COVID-19, there is a lot of content out there. Much of it isn't necessarily rooted in the science, but it was more so rooted in the digital media realities of trying to drive clicks and website traffic. And all of that is going to create a more tense atmosphere for us to step into when we seek to build community in digital spaces. Of course, we're all well aware that we're very much in the thick of election season right now. And Pew tells us that over half of Americans are worn out by political posts on social media. I'm surprised that number isn't higher, whereas 70% of Americans find online politics discussions, quote, exhausting. Many of you have perhaps encountered someone who has said, I've stepped away from social media until the election is over, or I've stepped away from social media just to try to find some time to disconnect. But the twin factors of the pandemic posts and the political posts create this rather tenuous foundation on which we might try to build any semblance of church community. It's not all a lost cause, though, and I'm going to tell you about why it's not a lost cause and why there's perhaps more reason for optimism in this conversation than at any point prior to right now during this pandemic. Just to call out a few different comments I've seen in the Zoom chat. Some have talked about how their church still has clergy and coffee virtually each week. Absolutely, that's great. I'm meeting for coffee with my church community on Sunday mornings as well. The pressure to gather in person is certainly significant, especially for rostered church leaders. And every church leader I've talked to has told me about the difficulties of navigating a congregation where so many are insistent on returning to in-person worship. Michael Weaver recommends watching The Social Dilemma on Netflix, and that's a movie that came out on Netflix a few weeks ago. I actually watched it on Friday night. It is fascinating. Check it out. It's got some really good acting by the actor who played Pete on Mad Men, if you've ever seen that show. It's a fascinating movie, an interesting dramatization of some of the challenges that social media poses for our society. But here's why community building is so important and why it's so important for church leaders to think about community building in this moment. From a theological standpoint, as church, we are called to step into this exhausting moment of confusion and polarization and anxiety, and to create experiences of Sabbath. But first and foremost, I see community building as an act of extending Sabbath rest into a weary landscape. It's our call as church leaders to think about encountering the exhaustion and the anxiety that exists in those spaces and responding thoughtfully with pauses and with prayers. Pastor Danielle opened up our Zoom today with just a 45-second moment to pause and to pray and reflect, and that felt so good. I'm already 6 Zoom calls into my day, and it was such a welcome, just brief moment of Sabbath. To get a little theological, though, we're called to create community because we serve a God who justifies. And social media has become increasingly this landscape of hyper-partisanship and cancel culture. There's been much written on the idea of shaming in social media spaces, the idea that if we don't say exactly the right things or show up exactly as our communities want us to show up, that will effectively be canceled and ostracized. It's not just something that affects celebrities who make gaffes on social media. The reality of virtue signaling in these spaces causes so many of us to say not just the things that are authentic on our minds, but the things that we think our communities or our social media followers want to hear. The idea of justification tells us that God makes things right, that our social media commentary is not what makes things right. And it's an important message to a landscape that's dealing with the realities of cancel culture, that our God is ultimately one who forgives and who reconciles. I think there's also something to be said from a theological lens about salvation and soteriology. The idea that our communities are unable to see a finish line right now. We don't know when the pandemic will end, but we know it won't be as soon as we want it to. We know that the election is November 3rd, but we have no idea how long our polarized political landscape will last. It's never been more important to remind our church communities about the reality of salvation through Jesus Christ. If we're not coming back through our digital community building to this soteriology, the idea that this finish line in Christ does exist, that these problems will end, then in some ways we're missing out. All this to say, the church has an opportunity to build community, and because of these things, Sabbath, justification, and salvation, we have more of an opportunity to build community than perhaps anybody else. I wanted to highlight a few examples of effective community building moments that I've seen recently in digital spaces. And these examples don't necessarily come from the church, but they translate well into some of the work that we're called to do. One of those tools is called Presently. This is a tool I started using at the start of September. And Presently is a free app that you download, and it asks me every morning at 9 a.m. to name one thing that I'm grateful for. I find Presently to be the most welcome text message I get all day, any day. I just love that moment of gratitude in which I can start my day off. And if I didn't get that text message from Presently, I would be bogged down with the details of my to-do lists and the stress of trying to continue to build connection in this digital landscape. Presently reminds me that there is something to be grateful for. And even though Presently isn't connected to social media, it's still building community in the sense that it has this group of followers who have downloaded the app and are using that app for rest and respite. I also am an avid follower of Calm, which is a daily mindfulness app. Calm has a resource called the Daily Calm. It's a 10-minute meditation in response to whatever's happening in the world. They also have lots of different meditations and different practices you can take related to mindfulness. Every morning I try to combine Calm's Daily Calm episode with a little bit of Richard Rohr and Richard Rohr's email newsletter. And I find that that's just the perfect way to start my day before I answer any emails or Slack messages or create any digital content. Again, Calm is an example of community building. It's not a social media post. It's not a Zoom call, right? But it's creating this experience of rest and disconnection in a time when all of us are short on those things. Just to call out a few of the comments in the Zoom chat. Michael posted the link to Presently. Jonathan said that our synod sent out a daily text and prayer when the pandemic started. Didn't appreciate it at first, but now appreciate the love and care. Yeah, absolutely. And what I think is so interesting about these resources of text and prayer is many of them are not digitally sophisticated in any sense. Sometimes it's just sending a 5-line email, which is text-based, that can have the most effect.
And that was our synod. And just so people know, we use Remind 101, which is like a classroom for teachers app. And that's what we use to send text message to the rostered ministers. So and not specifically for church app, but worked in that sense for us.
Yeah, Remind is a really good one. It's super easy to reach large communities. My wife, being a high school science teacher, she uses Remind to communicate with her students, as do all the teachers at our school.
And the one thing about that with Remind is that it wasn't, like you said, through social media, just through text. So we have a lot of older pastors who that's the only way that we're communicating with them, is the text prayer that they get.
So hopefully these examples, and I'm seeing the Remind link posted in the Zoom chat. Bill Stewart mentioned that Luther Seminary has a wonderful daily prayer known as the God Pause email devotional. Highly recommend subscribing to it. I read that most days as well. Moments of community building do not need to be on social media. They don't need to be synchronous. They don't need to be on Zoom. If something brings our communities together for an experience of grace, it's an act of community building. And hopefully these examples have shown you that there are more ways to build community than posting comments to social media. Now, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to build digital community in your context. So it's important to have a process for thinking about what digital community really looks like for you. And when we think about that process, what we're ultimately thinking about is how we can move beyond the proverbial box. I think if we were to draw that box of what we've thought of as digital community building, we've thought about social media posts, particularly on Facebook. We've thought about Zoom calls, and many churches have thought, let's do the same thing, but virtual. All of those work. There's a reason they're squarely in the middle of the box. So I'm not telling you to avoid the things that are in the middle of the box, but I'm telling you that if these things haven't worked for you, there are more ideas that are out there. There are more things we can try. And with the time to try them and enough creativity, we can find what those opportunities are. That's why I'm such a big proponent of the process of design thinking. I mentioned this last week. Design thinking is a 5-step process in which we identify a problem, come up with ideas to address that problem, and then build rapid solutions and test those solutions to see how to best solve that problem. I think design thinking is exactly what church leaders need in order to build community, and to build community through micro moments or opportunities that bring people together, perhaps asynchronously, perhaps for seconds or maybe a few minutes at a time. And it's a process that will help us to naturally move beyond the box of community building. In the next few slides, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the steps of design thinking and how they apply to this conversation on community building. There's obviously more to say about design thinking, so at the end of this section, I'll leave you with a few resources so you can explore this topic further. The first step of design thinking is this idea of empathizing. And what's interesting about the tech industry where I've worked is almost every company will say something about empathy in their core values. The tech industry, I think, is successful because it's so good at putting itself in the shoes, in the position of their users, of their audiences, and understanding what those audiences actually need. Empathizing is a process of intentional listening to determine what are the challenges that exist within your congregation and what are some of the things they want from their church. When we empathize, we make it possible for those in our church to be consistently heard. So empathizing can be a Zoom call, it can be a one-on-one, it can be a Google form. The idea with empathizing as a starting point for design thinking is that we cast a wide net and try to understand the varied and diverse sentiments that exist within our contexts. Not every community needs a reprieve from the political right now. Not every community needs to experience moments of Sabbath. Every church is going to require something a little different. And empathizing is how we start to define that. After we empathize, after we do these listening sessions, we move into a process of defining, trying to understand a test question. And a test question is going to be a question that's going to guide us in our discernment as we seek to find what community looks like in our context. Now, in my book, I talk a little bit about how we can use design thinking to craft a mission statement or mission and vision in our congregation. But in the context of community building, we want to avoid being too broad. So what I mean by that is the question, how do we build community, is a little too general and a bit too ambiguous in order to lead us to the specific design principles that we'll use to build community. If we hear during the empathize state, though, that our membership is feeling like they haven't had the same ability to serve in their communities, or perhaps they're feeling like they really miss the spirit of service that defined their church prior to March, a better test question might be, how do we engage our membership in volunteerism and service this fall? So what I think goes into a really good defining question, what goes into the test question from which design thinking proceeds, is specificity. What is the one thing you're seeking to address? What is the one thing that community means to your church that you think you have an opportunity to address? I also want to encourage you to not give up if you in this define process find yourself with a question that seems too difficult to tackle. We want our questions to be a little bit ambitious. If our questions invite our congregation to come up with a sense of disconnect and peace in the middle of a frantic day, that's going to be really hard in an environment where Americans are working 3 hours longer per day than they've ever worked. But still, if we know that that's our question, we can find a solution that moves the needle in small ways. So the question phase of design thinking is an ambitious phase. We want to reach for the stars here, and that's going to set us up for success later on. Before I move on, I'm going to just go through a couple of the comments in the Zoom. Joanne has a comment about the Ceaseless app, and it says it's a prompt that comes at the same time every morning. Yeah, and that's the same way I have the Presently app set up on my phone. Deacon Lynn suggests that many of the notifications Lynn receives are the same way too, and saying that if I say I'll come back later, I never come back. Yeah, I've certainly had that experience myself. Do look, by the way, at the snooze function in email. Emails and increasingly Slack messages and sometimes text messages, depending on what app you're using, have a snooze function where you can remind yourself to go back to something later on. I find myself using that all the time. Barbara also has a comment here. Asking what they want may result in one of those things identified that they already know, like online Bible studies. If the respondents don't know what grief discussions or children's bedtime stories might look like, those will probably not be suggested for what they need. So how to question is really important. And yeah, and Barbara, I think what's important here is to ask more questions at a higher level. Like tell me about how things are going. Tell me about where you find yourself on your faith journey right now. Tell me about how worship is going for you. Trying to stay at a level of exploration as opposed to a level of tactics and activities that the church does. The purpose of the empathizing state is not necessarily to lock in on opinions of the quality of your virtual coffee hour. So after we've empathized, after we've defined our test question, next step is to ideate. And ideate is kind of a fancy techie word for coming up with as many ideas as we possibly can. When I've done this in person with groups, we have usually an entire wall that's filled up with sticky notes, or usually have whiteboards where our dry erase markers run out of ink by the end. We want to be aggressive and ambitious with coming up with as many possible ideas to address our test question as we possibly can. One of the ways I think it's useful to do that is to use technology. And in a few minutes, I'll show you some digital whiteboard apps that you can use to facilitate high-powered digital brainstorming sessions. The end result of the ideate phase is what I refer to as a ruthless prioritization. We want to affirm all ideas. We want to save all possible ideas for later on. But the end result of the ideation phase is 1 to 3 ideas that we're going to put into practice to run a little pilot test to see if these things work for us. Once we've moved through the ideation phase, we're going to move into a prototype. And a prototype is where we move your ideas from a sticky note to maybe more of a storyboard. What I recommend with the prototyping phase is to take your ideas and to actually sketch them out, as in draw. What do they look like? Is it something in a virtual interface? Is it something involving people meeting for a socially distant walk at a state recreation area? Stick figures are great. Artistic quality doesn't necessarily matter at this point, but that act of moving from words on a sticky note to what the idea actually looks like can benefit from some visualization. So I recommend sketching here as opposed to just verbalizing. I also recommend at this prototyping phase to not consider any constraints until your prototypes are completed. One thing that churches are really good at is naming the constraints early in the brainstorming process. You've probably all experienced this as church leaders. It's not in the budget. We're not the Boy Scouts. We're not the Girl Scouts. It's not what we're called here to do. There are constraints, and there are good reasons to not move ideas into fulfillment. But let's consider those constraints at the very end of our brainstorming process. Seeing some preach and amen listed here. Ultimately, what we're going to do with our prototypes is to select one idea, one prototype. So if we came up with 100 sticky notes in the brainstorm phase and we storyboarded out 3 sketches of different prototypes we can try, our last step is to test, and to test one idea at a time. When we're testing, we want to be patient in evaluating effectiveness. And part of that comes from the idea that it takes our community a little bit of time to adapt to what we're trying anew. But if we're trying something on social media, it also takes a little time to break into the algorithms and to actually have our content show up in social media feeds. So if you're posting about something and nobody's seeing it, nobody's clicking on it, nobody's viewing it, give it a few weeks. Eventually, social media algorithms will catch on that something is important enough to make it into the circulation. All of these algorithms are kind of a giant black box. Nobody really understands them. In the 6 years I worked at Google, I didn't even understand how Google search results worked. So if you feel like you don't know how these things work, nobody really does. If you watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix, it'll give you an interesting visualization of how they think it works. You want to collect some data during the testing process, KPIs, how many people engaged, what did they do, did they find that activity valuable? And ultimately, it's that data that should inform whether the ideas we test become permanent fixtures of our congregation. Quote of the day from Jonathan Conrad: "Ideate isn't even the Bible, therefore we can't do it." No, we can't. You're absolutely right, Jonathan. How silly of me to suggest ideate as a phase of the design thinking process. And Joanne Stabler here mentions envisioning empathy phase turning up nothing, but we need to worship together. Suggested things, the simplest thing being to send me prayer requests and nothing, no responses, ideas for this situation. Yeah, Joanne, I think that this is a common thing, a common situation. A lot of churches are navigating this right now. I think part of this comes back to change management and educating on the possibilities of what could exist in digital community if we all pool our resources and our ideas together to make these things happen. Also, I find,
go ahead, Ryan.
I find when you step into a collaborative session with multiple folks on a Zoom call, perhaps, sometimes folks are less hasty to reject an idea if they're meeting synchronously than they might be, say, via email or social media. Yeah, go ahead, Pastor Danielle.
I think one of the things that is really important for us in this time that I think Ryan did really well in our first session is to remind us that part of our pastoral mindset is our people might not be willing to go into the digital space, but there are people in the digital space. So if your congregation's like, forget it, screw it, we don't want to talk about this, that doesn't mean as pastor you can't maintain a Facebook for your congregation with hopeful scripture that gets shared, and you ask, I mean, there's a pastor in the Baltimore or Delaware, Maryland Synod who every week is posting on the community Facebook page for the community serves that says, how can our congregation pray for you this week? Because his congregation wouldn't give prayer requests, but the community Facebook page was giving him prayer requests. So he said, okay, I will pray for the community that's responding to this, even when my congregation is not. And so one of the really hard things about this is to tell people, okay, because I'm also pastor in this community and not just to a congregation within walls. And so how do we remember that our digital space is beyond just that? I had somebody the other day who said they did a drive-in something and they had 4 new families come who were not part of the congregation because they happened to find them through a digital space. And I think there is a real reminder to us that if our people are saying, no, we don't want to go there, that there are people who are already there who are aching for the gospel. What would it look like for your Facebook page for 2 weeks? I'm putting up hopeful scriptures. That's it. Try it out. Maybe your people might say, oh, I really actually like that pastor sharing some hope. Great. But what do we do with our community that is also looking to engage? Okay, now I'm going to mute myself. Bye. Okay.
No, that's really great. And actually, I was reading a newspaper article this weekend in Madison about how some of the churches that are meeting in parking lots are in areas where there are balconies overlooking the parking lots, and the balconies are full of people going to church, not really at the church, but they are involved in the worship because they're listening in from their balconies, watching what's going on. So these community moments, sometimes it's difficult to even see the ripples that will branch out across your neighborhoods well beyond the walls of your congregation.
And I do want to say one more thing. Sorry. The other part, Ryan, when you talk about this is that, like, I know I work for Churchwide. We're going to ask you to do a parochial report. We're going to ask you to talk about numbers and all of these things. But part of what is so important in this digital place is for you to be able to tell stories and for you to say, yeah, let me tell you about the 4 balconies. Or let me tell you about the 3 people that we've never interacted with before that left us a comment on Facebook. So despite the fact that we will ask you for numbers, the gospel does not ask you for that. The gospel asks you for testimony of Jesus. So that's got to be central to how we also talk about this in the life of our congregations.
Amen. So I wanted to also give you a few tools that are free to use and web-based to guide you in your design thinking processes. It says Coggle. I actually mixed up the slide headers. This is a tool called Ziteboard, Z-I-T-E board. It's a free whiteboarding software. Anyone can access it. It's great in Zoom spaces. This is Coggle, not Ziteboard. Coggle is a mind mapping software, which is excellent for design thinking, especially during the brainstorming phases, coming up with many ideas and seeing how those ideas branch out from one another. Once you get into actually implementing some of the ideas, I recommend a tool called Trello. It's a free project management software. And what Trello allows you to do is to keep track of the individual tasks that you might need to complete in order to bring your prototypes to fruition. So I use Trello to track, the 10 or 15 things I have to do as part of this project, and I move them from to do to doing to done. It's a nice way to help organize my projects and organize my life. And then a few book bag recommendations on design thinking before breakout sessions begin. The design of everyday things is not necessarily about design thinking, but it's about why great design matters and how you can be a great designer. And then 2 specific books I recommend on design thinking include The Design of Business, as well as Tim Brown's Change by Design. Okay, we're going to move to our breakouts, and we're going to spend about 8 minutes in breakout sessions. We've got 2 breakout questions for this morning. Question number 1, how can you engage your community in the shared work of digital community building and outreach? So thinking about how we can avoid this being too pastor-centric. And then question 2, how can you use digital tools to provide that experience of Sabbath rest in a time of over-connection and widespread uncertainty? Feel free to take a screenshot if you know how to take a screenshot of these questions. I will also go ahead and post these in the Zoom chat. And then in just a moment here, you will see an invitation to join your breakout sessions. I will come back at about 5 minutes to the top of the hour. All right, so the discussion questions are in the Zoom chat, and we're off to our breakouts. We'll see you all in a few minutes.
You should get a prompt to accept an invitation to move into a breakout room.
For those unable to do that, if you have any questions you want to ask now, you can do that. Apologize if you couldn't get into the breakout room, but if you have a question, feel free to chat it or just unmute yourself, and we can have our own conversation here as needed.
Yeah, we could even discuss some of the questions on the slide. We still got maybe a dozen or so who are still here. So if anyone has thoughts on how these ideas or this process of community building might work in your context, I would certainly love to hear them.
Jonathan, we might be able to re-put you in a breakout room. Michael, did you see that comment?
I'd like to stay if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Absolutely. Do you have thoughts on this, Jonathan? Like, how do you think this might work for you?
Well, luckily, I think our congregation has been pretty free-flowing with what's been going on. We started with a lot more digital, going online, doing pre-produced worship, to now doing outdoor worship, and having good shepherds calling people. We try to do it every week, but our members are saying, you don't have to call me every week. So, but they have a group that they call. So everybody is touched and reached out to. And we restarted our homebound communion. And so every week we're now sending out about 20 communion packages to those who are, some are homebound, some just can't get there. And so, but I think our staff has been pretty good at throwing out ideas and then trying to see which ideas can grow some roots and some strength.
It's so interesting to hear the phone calls working so well, because it's a very low-tech example of community building. Sometimes text messages can be just as effective. My church does passing of the peace via text message, and SMS and phone are 2 channels of community building just as mobile apps and social media are.
We started doing a weekly e-newsletter too. So instead of the monthly printed, we're doing weekly, and it seems like people are actually reading it, and we're trying to make it a nice design so people will spotlight it. Like some of the newsletters you see, click on this for more information.
Mm-hmm.
That's been turning out well.
Which are you using a tool for your newsletters, like MailChimp?
I think is it MailChimp?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's probably the most popular one. That's a good one.
It's kind of funny, we talk about that, even just something simple as a remind or text message. I feel very connected to K&G because they send me a message with a coupon like every other day. the Outfitters store, like I signed up for a discount on when I bought a couple of suits, and now I just get in there, it's them, and it's like Rack Room Shoes. It's like get the coupons all the time, and I know what's going on with them. So as funny as that is, it's kind of like, that's where we're at, it's right in your pocket and it gets your attention because I don't know if it's work. I don't know if it's coupons. I don't know if it's fun. I don't know if it's family. I check it and it's there. So.
Yeah. So if you use a church website platform like Subsplash, you can get access to mobile apps. And mobile apps give you access to those push notifications. Like the designers are, the push notification I'm constantly getting, I'm either getting them from Dunkin' Donuts or from Panera, just trying to tell me to come get even more coffee and even more donuts. And I usually say, sure, I guess I need that. But sometimes push notifications in churches can be really effective too.
Yeah, when we used Breeze, church software, we did that when I was in my congregation beforehand, and you could schedule those out. You can organize them by team. You can pull up, all right, who's my youth ministry team, or who's my communications team, or who are my 2 or 3 volunteers that help with the bulletin or the newsletter, and you can set weekly reminders or whatever. It had a lot of cool tools built in where you can, if somebody was assigned a particular area of ministry, if somebody submitted something, you could have a direct email be pushed out to an individual who's in charge of a certain ministry. It's a pretty neat tool. Breeze.
Yeah, Breeze is great. Like the tagging you can do. Mm-hmm. Jonathan, hey, have you sinned yet today? Come confess. Yeah, it's got to be sure to send that one later in the day. If you send it to folks at 6 a.m., they'd probably be like, no, I'm good so far.
Are we ready for our 30-second countdown here?
I think so.
Back in.
Ryan, I had a question actually for Danielle, because she and I are kind of in the same moment because we have young kids and trying to juggle everything. So I wanted to know from her, have you found it even possible to totally let go so you can like be mom or wife? Have you?
Probably not, but that's okay. No, it's funny, Ryan, when you were talking about the empathy thing, what struck me was how important right now I think the empathy is to do in cross-generational sections. Because when you said like, how's worship? I mean, it is a fight every Sunday for our family to get on the couch and watch worship right as it's about to be nap time for our 3-year-old and our 2-year-old and all of those kind of things. And what we really need is like pauses, like 45-second pauses, because I can't do 45 minutes right now. And so, which might be very different than someone's who like, I'm missing my Sunday school class and I really want some Bible study, that kind of thing. Like I really value a text message or just a little prayer, that, and when I say 45 seconds, I mean 45 seconds. I don't mean 5 minutes. And so I think the other thing is that's really hard about this is nothing is being compartmentalized. Like you said, 3 hours longer of work days because work is going, like, hey, I took an hour here, so I'm going to do a couple emails at night and those kind of things. I think the same thing is true. We can't be like, here's our faith in a 45-minute chunk in a Bible study. I need like 45 seconds along the way. So I wonder about the empathy part being really intentional for it to be cross-section. I don't know what that word is, but something sectioned.
Yeah, and Jonathan and Danielle, like I have a 10-month-old, so I can totally relate to how those I need 45 seconds. I don't need a 90-minute Zoom call at the end of the day. So a couple of just closing remarks. I hope you've gotten some ideas out of these 3 webinars that you can immediately put into practice in your context. And if not, if that idea fairy is still buzzing in your ear and won't stop chirping, what I'd like to do is to invite you to consider joining the Ministry in a Digital Age learning community through Luther Seminary's Faith Lead. So this is going to be a really small group session. Only 20 ministry professionals will be a part of it. And what we're going to do is to meet on a weekly basis for some group coaching to implement digital ministry projects in your context. We're going to do design thinking. We're going to do projects together. We're going to use tools like Coggle and Trello, and we're going to make some of these ideas happen. So check that out. It's on the slides, and I think it'll also be in the Zoom chat in just a second. It's also on Faith Lead's website. It starts next Monday. One other quick plug, the book, Grace in Gigabytes, Being Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture, is now available for pre-order, and you can get it right now in the Fortress Press store with 30% off for attending today's webinar. So just a couple of closing thoughts then for me. Ministry in a digital age is a topic that it seems like so few of us had on our radar 7 months ago, and now it's the water in which we're swimming. It can be an overwhelming and exciting and frustrating and enlightening journey. And sometimes it's all of those things at the same time. When we approach this work with a graceful mindset, both towards ourselves and towards others, when we remember that we're all in this together and we're all on this learning journey, this will be a fun and sometimes frustrating process, but it will lead us towards a bright new future for the church. It's a future I'm really excited about. It's a future that's going to bring in new generations to the gospel message. And I think all of you, as part of this webinar, hopefully are leaving better equipped to do that work. Blessing to all of you.
Brian, thank you very much. I've already got an idea for our church. I've already passed it on to my pastor, so I would say this was worth it. Thank you very much for hosting.
Glad to hear it. And I'll hang out on the line for a few minutes, just like last week, in case there's any other questions. Appreciate all of you tuning in.
Yeah, and just a reminder that we will send out an email with the links. You can share them if you want to have clips showed with your councils. Please feel free to do that. You'll get an email from Southeastern Synod. It will also have a survey about what might be helpful next. Pastor Michael and Pastor John and I were just saying we could do a lot if we collaborated, right? And so how else do you need our synods collaborating? What else might be helpful to you that would help move you in this? And I just want to say to you, part of what is hard about doing ministry in a digital age is it's got to come out of you. And a lot of us are exhausted and worn out. And so as you are thinking about God pauses and text messages, be with Jesus first. Spend some time with Jesus first so it can come out of you. I'm exhausted and I'm worn out and I'm tired. And some days when that is the truth, you don't have to produce any more digital content. You get to sit and be with Jesus, because Jesus will fill you up and then go produce some digital content. And so know that that is an important part of this ministry and in this work. And you are not a content producer alone. You are a beloved child of God. You are a public leader in this church, and we are grateful for you. And we are going to ask you for survey questions, and we are going to ask you to share recordings, but all of that because you are a child of God leading others into the love of Jesus Christ. So thank you. And yeah, blessings be with you in this day. We're grateful for you.
Yes, thank you again. Ryan's here to answer if you have any questions that you really want to ask him. Otherwise, have a good rest of your Monday. So we'll hang out here for just a few moments.
I have one question. Would the Remind app be appropriate for like a church prayer group? I mean, that's one of the things, you know, we've got a pretty strong prayer team. And right now it's being used by email, and that can be kind of cumbersome because emails get missed. So I was just curious if anybody's used.
Meredith, the Remind is not as good for people collaborating. It's good for sending out prayers.
Okay.
The app Echo allows you to create small groups. And Echo, you can pray. Now, Echo does cost, I think it's $4.99 to download, but it does allow you to create prayer groups in it. And then you can also set up like notes, like, and I don't know if I already deleted the notifications on my phone from my Echo app. Yeah, this morning, like you can't see that, never mind, that's done. But all those blue arrows are my Echo app reminders of who I'm supposed to pray for on Monday morning.
Okay. So I'll pick that out. Thank you. Thank you.
But you can also create small groups in Echo, which I think is helpful.
Thank you.
Added the link in there for Echo, new.echoprayer.com.
I don't know, Michael or John, if you've encountered any other prayer ones, or Ryan. But
just in terms of communication, GroupMe, you know, that's more of a generic communication tool for groups, but not specifically prayer oriented. So we use GroupMe for various things. And sometimes there are message apps built into platforms like something like Breeze software, where it's a church communication, church management software. Some have that capability, but it's not quite as conducive maybe as something like GroupMe or Echo.
Yeah, I've used GroupMe to do everything from plan camping trips to like communicate with confirmation students. It's one of my favorites.
And I would say the other one is WhatsApp. Is really an easy group messaging that is not on your text message or not on a email chain. That is really, really easy.
We're going to put all of these in the email that goes out. We'll have links to all of these, and all the different, because by my count, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least eight apps we've referenced so far during the meeting that I'm keeping track of. So we'll put them all in the email for you.
Yeah. And I'm bad at math, and I know it's a lot, John. So. Thank y'all. We will see you, and blessings on your day.
Thanks again, Ryan.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
All right. Take care.